Hi everyone, welcome to my first YouTube channel. My name is Agora and I'm looking for this channel to be a space for me to talk about whatever I want, but also a place to exchange opinions and ideas for anyone who's interested or willing in participating. So for my first YouTube video, I thought it'd be fun to do a deep dive on Omer's Odyssey, but given the fact that the much anticipated Christopher Nolan movie is coming out soon, I'll also be sharing my 2 cents on what my hopes are for the upcoming film. Just as a disclaimer at the outset, I'm not an expert in this by any means. I just find the classical world to be extremely fascinating and I enjoy talking about it and analyzing it to the best of my ability. Also, in case someone isn't familiar with the Odyssey and wants to go into the movie completely fresh, just be aware that I will be discussing the plot of the story and therefore spoilers are ahead. And then lastly, before we begin, English is my second language, so I apologize in advance if I get some of the terminology wrong. So without further ado, let's get into it. The Odyssey is a massive piece of work. It spans 24 books, and so I will not be able to cover everything in this video. With that in mind, however, here is the plan for what I want to talk about. So, first, I'd like to talk about the figure of Homer and the role of bards. Secondly, I'd like to go into the Odyssey structure and the origins of this story, especially talking about the context within the broader literary return narratives. Then I'd like to talk about the key characters just to help us a little bit keep track, and then go into the main plot points of the Odyssey. Then I'd like to talk about the key themes of this story, and last but not least, give my 2 cents of what my hopes are for Christopher Nolan's film. Homer is one of the most famous names in ancient literature, with his epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey, forming two pillars of Western culture that are still incredibly impactful to this day, so much so that Hollywood is still investing money in the production of retelling of his stories. Equally famous is a century long debate about whether Homer was actually a real person. So, on one hand, Greek historians such as Herodotus place him as having lived around 850 BCE. This was the main school of thought around Homer's existence until the 1700s, when scholars started questioning the figure of Homer and kind of debating whether Homer was actually the collection of a series of stories told by a group of bards who passed down the stories of the Iliad and the Odyssey through their storytelling, and then eventually were kind of collated as part of one epic poem, being the Iliad and another being the Odyssey. Although we will likely never know the answer to this question, the current consensus is that Homer probably never existed and that the two epic poems are actually part of an oral formulaic tradition, with stories being told by professional storytellers, which we'll refer to as bards, or in the Greek idoi, and passed down through generations until they were finally collated. The etymologies of the name Homer also provide ambiguous clues, as they are connected to the expression home heron, or the blind, which mirrors the classical understanding that Homer was a blind bard, but also to the verb homerein, loosely translated to coming together, which can either allude to a group of bards coming together or more generally to the spaces in which people were coming together to listen to these epic poems being told. Regardless of Homer's identity, I think the key element, though, is the role of the bard and the context in which these stories were told. Epic poems like the Iliad and the Odyssey would have been narrated verbally in town squares or anywhere where there was a group of people gathered together. And bards weren't seen just as entertainers, but they also served a very important educational and often pedagogical role. They were there to explain through their stories what the societal expectations were, how people should behave, what they should be afraid of, and their stories had to have heroes who were imperfect figure, but they were people who had an ability that was so distinguished, like for example Achilles and his strength, or Odysseus and his cunning, that could inspire admiration from listeners. It was also an educational setting and often used to reaffirm societal expectations, societal norms, including patriarchal structures. For example, Odysseus and the Odyssey have a very strong double standard when it comes to women, their role in society, and include warning tales of association with women that fall outside of these approved norms. As we discuss the story of the Odyssey and its characters, it would be great if you could keep in mind how these stories might have affected you and your understanding of the world if for whatever reason you were transported back into ancient Greece and you were hearing this for the first time. The Odyssey is thought to be the second series in a collection of epics called Nostoi, or Returns, all of which tell the story of Greek heroes returning home after the Trojan War. Fun fact, Nostoi is probably where the word nostalgia actually comes from. If you remember Agamemnon from the Iliad, his return home is another story contained in the Nostoi, and it's actually extremely tragic. So if you're interested in that, I can do another video talking about his return home. As I said before, the Odyssey is composed of 24 books and is a lot more complex in terms of structure than the Iliad because it uses flashbacks as a narrative tool, whereas the Iliad would have been a much more linear storytelling. In fact, the story begins in medias res, or literally in the middle of things, basically in the middle of Odysseus' return home. All of this is to say that I have an extremely immense respect for bards. When I was in school, we had to study the Odyssey and the Iliad, and we had to learn loads of passages in Greek and kind of have to be able to recall them by memory. And I can't imagine having to do that with the whole freaking story, but also having to do that in front of an audience. So props to them. There are so many characters within the Odyssey, and there's so much mythology that is connected to its key figures. So, for the sake of time, I will focus on covering a key important characters just to help us understand the story as we progress. So, when I talk about the key characters, I'm going to be talking about the humans, but also as this is a Greek piece of work, of course, the gods will play just as important of a part. So we will cover the key godlike figures in this section as well. So when talking about humans, obviously the most important human to keep in mind is Odysseus. Odysseus is the main protagonist of the story, and he is our hero. And of course, the Odyssey is named after him. It's actually thought that his name, so Odysseus, derives from the verb odysomai, which essentially means to hate or be angry at, but it can also be referred in a passive sense in terms of the hate that Odysseus is the recipient of, and that makes his journey home a lot more difficult than it needs to be. He is the king of Ithaca, which is a small island on the west side of Greece, and is the brains behind the famous Trojan horse, which ultimately puts an end to the Trojan War. So, unlike many of his hero peers, he is not famous for his godlike characteristics or for his strength or his bravery in battle, but he is famous for his metis, which is his cunning intelligence. He is also extremely curious, which is oftentimes a double-edged sword. Another human character who's important is Penelope. Penelope is Odysseus's wife. She is in Ithaca awaiting her husband's return, and through cunning of her own, she is trying to keep her house and the kingdom away from the hands of suitors who are after Odysseus's throne and Penelope herself. And then third kind of main human character is Telemachus. Telemachus is Odysseus's son. He is also waiting in Ithaca and trying to understand what's happened to his father while also protecting his mother and kind of the throne. From a god's side of things, instead, the main ones that we'll be discussing are Athena. So Athena is the goddess of war and practical reason, and she favors Odysseus, of course, because of his intelligence. And then we have Poseidon. Poseidon is the god of the sea. He wages the ultimate vendetta against Odysseus, and we'll talk about that in a second. But he is the main contributing factor as to why Odysseus is delayed in his return home. As I mentioned before, the Odyssey is composed of 24 books, so we'll not be able to cover the story in a huge amount of detail, but there are some aspects that I would like to spend a little bit more time on because I believe that they're really important in being able to understand the story and the characters. I'd like to start with the very first line of the Odyssey, specifically of the proem. So like any epic poem, the Odyssey begins with the proem, which is the section where the poet or the bard is invoking a goddess or a muse and is basically asking her to give them the inspiration and the skill and frankly also the mnemonic ability to be able to recall and narrate the story appropriately while also preparing the listener for the journey that they're about to embark on, including giving them the key concepts and the key themes that they're supposed to be picking up from the story. The first line of the Odyssey reads as follows, and I'm not going to read this in meter, but essentially says, Andra moyenne pemusa polyutropon osmalla polla plankte. Or in English, this is translated as, Speak to me, O muse, of the man of multifaceted ingenuity who wandered for long. There are really two main important elements that I want to draw your attention in with regards to this verse. First of all is the word andra, or man. The fact that the proem begins with this word really emphasizes to us that this isn't really a story about gods or monsters, but it is the story about a man. And this man is described to be polytropon, which means having multifaceted ingenuity. So Odysseus is cunning, but he is cunning in a way where he's always able to shape his intelligence in a way that's going to help him get out of whatever situation he's in. So it's an ingenuity that shifts in the way that's going to be most favorable to him. We also know, as part of this, that he has been away from home for a long time. This man is, of course, Odysseus, son of Laerte, king of Ithaca, which is, as I said before, a small island on the western coast of Greece. Our story begins in media res, or essentially as the storyline has already progressed. Specifically, it begins at the Council of the Gods, where Athena is trying to get other gods to agree to pass a motion for Odysseus to be able to finally return home, which he hasn't been able to do because Poseidon is really angry with him and is trying to do his best to block his return to Ithaca. The gods agree that he should be allowed to return home, and so they send Hermes, who is the messenger god, over to the nymph Calypso. So he goes to this island called Ogygia, where the nymph Calypso has held Odysseus hostage, for lack of a better word, for 7 years. And Hermes essentially tells Calypso that Odysseus has to be allowed to return home. And so Odysseus leaves the island on his boat, but Poseidon is really not happy with this god's decisions. And so he essentially shipwrecks Odysseus and he lands on the island of the Phoenicians. In the meantime, Telemachus, who is Odysseus' son, and Penelope, who is Odysseus' wife, are dealing with a very tense situation back in Ithaca. Remember, the Trojan War has been happening for 10 years, and it's been 10 years since the end of the Trojan War. So from their point of view, Odysseus has been missing from Ithaca for 20 years. During his prolonged absence, a group of noblemen or suitors have now flooded the court and are basically camping out there, awaiting for Penelope to make a decision on who she will marry as a replacement, therefore giving the selected noblemen the power of the kingdom of Ithaca. Telemachus is really stressed and prompted by Athena, he goes on this journey to try and understand what actually happened to his father. So as part of this journey, he visits the home of other warriors that had participated in the Trojan War to try and understand whether his father had died or essentially what was going on. As part of this, he meets Menelaus, who is the king of Sparta, and his wife Helen. If you remember her from the movie Troy, she is kind of the figure who started the whole, according to mythology, she started the whole Trojan War. And Menelaus essentially tells him, look, we won the war. Odysseus was fine. He didn't die during battle. He set off on a voyage with his countrymen. And so Telemachus doesn't really know what to think. He starts to doubt as to whether his father will ever come home or whether he has just died on his return home. As I said before, meanwhile, Odysseus is shipwrecked and he lands on the island of the Phoenicians. He is found by Nausicaa, who is a very young and happy, beautiful girl who also happens to be the daughter of the king of the Phoenicians. So she takes him in, brings him to court. He is welcomed as a guest, although he doesn't reveal his identity to begin with. So he's there at the Phoenicians' court, and one night, one of the bards, famous bards, they are telling the story of the Trojan War and all of the participants and what happened during this tragic 10-year fight. So overcome by emotion at this point, Odysseus, he starts crying, at which point the king is really confused as to why this random man is crying hearing about the Trojan War, and so demands to know his identity. Odysseus decides to reveal who he is. At this stage, our timeline shifts to 10 years in the past, and we're at the final days of the Trojan War, which ends in the favor of the Greeks through the use of the Trojan horse. And who is the mastermind behind the Trojan horse, if not our very own friend Odysseus? After the Greek victory, he embarks on his journey home, which is supposed to be quite short, considering that Troy and Ithaca are quite close. but actually ends up embarking on a 10-year journey. Part of this flashback that Odysseus is telling to the Phoenician court, he recounts lots of stories and different events that have happened to him during this time, a lot of tragedy along the way, and a lot of gruesome ways in which his companions have died. However, we'll focus on three main events that are probably the most important in terms of a plot development. And these will be the encounter with the Cyclops Polyphemus, the encounter with the witch Circe, and the encounter with the nymph Calypso. So the Cyclops story begins when Odysseus and his crew land on this random island. They don't really know where they are, is quite curious and wants to explore, wants to know what's on it, which kind of shows how his curiosity kind of acts as a double-edged sword. So as they're exploring this island, they come across this cave, and in the cave they see lots of cheese. They're super happy. So they walk in uninvited and they start helping themselves to all these goodies. At one point, though, the owner of these wonderful goodies and the owner of this cave comes back in, and it happens to be a huge cyclops by the name of Polyphemus. And he comes in, he covers the entrance of the cave door with a massive boulder. And so the men are obviously terrified. The Cyclops spots them, and first thing he does, taken with the excitement of a bunch of little human nuggets, he takes a couple of Odysseus' companions and decides to eat them. So now they're quite in a pickle. They're in a cave that's blocked by a massive boulder that they can't open, and they're in this cave with a cyclops that is more than willing to eat them. So Odysseus decides to use the only real skill that he has, which is his intelligence. So he devises this whole plan. The humans get the Cyclops very drunk, and when asked by the Cyclops what his name is, Odysseus doesn't give his real name, but actually refers to himself as being no one. The night goes on, Odysseus charms the Cyclops, they're having a good time, they're drinking wine, until the Cyclops goes into a very drunken sleep, at which point the men take a wooden stake that has been sharpened, set it on fire, and set it through the Cyclops' only eye, essentially blinding him. Now, the Cyclops is, of course, woken up by this and is in extreme pain. So he starts shouting to his other Cyclops friends, asking for help. But the problem is that he's shouting, "No one hurt me. No one blinded me."
Got it!
And so his Cyclops friends are probably like, "Why are you waking us up in the middle of the night if no one is hurting you?" So no one comes to his aid. The Cyclops falls back asleep. The night turns into day, at which point the Cyclops has to let out his sheep that are providing him with the very good cheese that the humans had originally been attracted to. So he does so, and in order to let them out, he of course has to move the big boulder, but he knows that the humans are still there. So he has to make sure that they're not escaping. And how does he do this? He uses his hands to kind of feel around and make sure that he doesn't feel any little human heads trying to make a run for it. Little does he know, though, that during the night and after he had passed out from the pain, that the humans, led by Odysseus, had tied themselves to the underbelly of the sheep. So when he opens the cave to let the sheep out and is feeling around, he actually can't feel the humans being let out with the sheep because they're tied to the underbelly, and so he can only feel the top part of their backs. The humans are able to escape, and by the time that Polyphemus realizes what's happened, it's essentially too late because Odysseus and his crew are back on the ship and they're sailing away from the island. So he's screaming, he's really upset, but again, no one's coming to his aid because he keeps saying no one has escaped, no one has escaped, and so no one's kind of taking him seriously. At which point, Odysseus is overcome by hubris, which means he's overcome by a shameless pride. And he's so proud of himself and how he's managed to save himself and his remaining companions that from the top of his ship, as he's running away, he's like, actually, you know that no one that you thought actually hurt you? Well, his name is not no one. His name is Odysseus of Ithaca, and he's the one who bested you. Now, little does Odysseus know that Polyphemus actually has a very powerful father, and the father is little old Poseidon. Now that Polyphemus knows his actual name, he can go to his father and he essentially tells him, "Look at what Odysseus has done to me." And this begins Poseidon's very, very long, vengeful quest against Odysseus. He believes that Odysseus has shown him immense disrespect and therefore makes this his life mission. Not life because he's mortal, but you know what I mean. He makes it his mission to ensure that Odysseus never returns home to Ithaca. And this is essentially the main catalyst that takes Odysseus on this wild journey that doesn't allow him to return home for a very, very long time. The second event that I want to cover is the encounter with the witch Circe. After Odysseus' crew succumbs to curiosity and open a bag of winds that was gifted to them by the god Elis, they essentially are set completely off course and they land on what they think is an uninhabited island. Odysseus orders part of the crew to go explore, and so a group of men led by his second in command by the name of Eurylochus, they essentially set off and they go explore this island. After a little while, they encounter a woman by the name of Circe, and she appears to be very amicable and very friendly. She lives on this island and is surrounded by her many pets, which include lions. And so she invites the men in for a glass of wine. And so they all gladly accept this offer and this invitation to enter her home, other than Odysseus' second in command. So little do the men know, though, that once they're invited in and drink this little lovely glass of wine, that at the snap of a finger, this woman actually is able to turn them into pigs. And this is our main character of the story, which is the witch Circe. This subset of Odysseus' crew, other than Eurylochus, is now led into the pigsty, and Eurylochus, panicking, runs back to the ship and he tells Odysseus about what has happened. So Odysseus decides to set off on his own and visit Circe to try and convince her to turn the men back into humans. On his way, though, Hermes, our messenger god friend, approaches him and warns him of the tricks that Circe has in mind to bewitch him. So Odysseus follows the guidance given by Hermes, and his stay actually turns into a very pleasant one, both for him and for his crew, who have been, in the meantime, turned back into men. Odysseus begins a relationship with the witch Circe, and Circe falls in love with him. And he's actually quite happy there, so much so that it's after a year that his companions go to Odysseus and remind him, like, bro, we're on a journey back home. We need to, this has been fun and all, but we need to go back into sea and try and get back to Ithaca. Odysseus therefore reluctantly agrees, and he asks Circe for the opportunity to be able to leave the island that they're on. Circe agrees. However, she tells him that before doing so, it would be best for him to go consult the seer Tiresias, who resides in the underworld. Odysseus does so. He goes with his crew down to Tiresias, and Tiresias gives him three specific pieces of information. The first, he tells him that it is Poseidon's anger that is causing him to not be able to return home, and his journey onwards will be made much more difficult because of it. The second is that on the island of Thrinacia, the companions must not touch the cattle that is sacred to the sun, otherwise, they will all be killed. The third, he informs Odysseus of the situation back in Ithaca, and he lets him know about the suitors and the fact that Penelope and Telemachus are trying to protect themselves and the throne. But he also does reassure him that he will return to Ithaca and that he will be able to live out a very long life back home. After his ascent back from the underworld, Odysseus and their crew set off on their journey and bid farewell to the goddess Circe. The third episode I want to cover is the encounter with the nymph Calypso. The ironic thing is that Odysseus spends most of his time, 7 years to be exact, of his 10-year voyage home with the nymph Calypso in the island of Ogygia. So essentially, if you think about it, this is 7 years plus the year that we've mentioned that he spent with the witch Circe, which really means that he's actually traveled only for 2 of the famed 10 years on his voyage home. Now, how does Odysseus meet Calypso? Well, he is actually shipwrecked, one of his many shipwrecks. He is shipwrecked on the island of Ogygia completely alone. So if you remember, the seer had told him that they really needed to be careful with that cattle that the sun really loved. And guess what all the companions did when they got to the famed island? They ate all of this cattle, which prompted Zeus to essentially strike them all with a thunderbolt, hence the shipwreck that kills essentially all of Odysseus' companions. When he lands or he arrives on the island of Ogygia, he is greeted by the nymph Calypso, who is very, very taken by him and ends up remaining on this island for 7 years, filled with a lot of luxury and food, and they enter into a relationship. This is presented almost as an imprisonment because Odysseus is on this island, he has no ship and he has no means of leaving, and he's almost kind of confused by Calypso's seduction of him. At this point in the story, Odysseus has encountered a lot of female adversaries to his return home. We have Circe, who we've talked about, the sirens, Scylla, etc. But I think Calypso is probably the strongest example of the societal norms that I was referencing earlier. So Calypso and her seduction are blamed for Odysseus's decision to remain on the island for so long. She offers him riches, a luxurious life, love, and the ability of becoming immortal. If he accepts, however, he has to forego his return to Ithaca. So, as he's narrating this story to the Phoenician court and to us by extension, Odysseus is clear that during his time he is extremely depressed. He's longing for home and his wife, and he just wants to leave Ojija and return to Ithaca. However, I think there's an other element to this wanting to return home as well. If he doesn't return home, so if he doesn't get out of Ojija and return back to Ithaca, if this nostos or this return is not completed, this will completely obliterate all of his efforts so far, all of his achievements, and all the way he has used his intelligence to be able to overcome the challenges put in front of him. Essentially, if he doesn't return home, he will succumb to a fate that for the ancient Greeks was much worse than death, and that is the fate of being forgotten. Therefore, he refuses all the divine gifts offered by the nymph, refuses the gift of immortality, and after 7 years, once Hermes is sent by the gods to communicate the message, Calypso releases Odysseus, who can then continue on his journey home. At this point, the flashback ends, and we're back at the king's court with the rest of the Phoenicians. The Phoenician king, who's very touched by Odysseus' story, arranges for him to be able to go home. So they prepare a ship and they give him everything he needs to be able to return to Ithaca. And so he's finally able, after 20 years, to set foot back on his beloved island. He has to be very careful, though, because as we know, there is a group of suitors that are in his court and in his home that are waiting for Penelope to make a decision on who she will marry, and therefore who will become the next king of Ithaca. Therefore, he devises a plan with Athena to be able to essentially gain back power. He disguises himself an old man and only makes himself known to a couple of very trusted people, including his son Telemachus. Now, in his return home, there's actually a very touching passage where even though he's disguised as an old man, his dog, Argos, recognizes him, and he's a very old dog at this point, but he's so happy to see his master that he has this kind of fit of joy and then ends up passing away. And so there's this very emotional scene between Odysseus and his dog, who was just waiting for his master to return home. As I said, Odysseus makes himself known to a few trusted individuals through an arranged plan. Odysseus and Telemachus and a group of trusted guards end up actually killing all of the suitors, not only them, but also all of the female servants that were in his court who he believed had had relationships with the suitors. So he basically there's a complete slaughter of everyone there. The only, interestingly enough, and going back to my earlier point about the importance of being remembered, is that the only person that he spares is the bard. Again, kind of linking back to the importance of the story being told. Otherwise, it's all for nothing. So at the end, Odysseus is now back at home, and he's reunited with his wife and his son. And at the end, we have one last divine intervention, which essentially is put in place to avoid a whole civil war, because all the families of the suitors are actually very upset about the fact that Odysseus has come back and has slaughtered everyone. And so Athena intervenes to kind of make peace between the parties to ensure that there isn't a civil war on the island of Ithaca as a consequence of Odysseus's actions. And that kind of concludes our Odyssey story. We've talked about some of these already, but I just wanted to touch on a couple of additional themes of the Odyssey. The first is the double standard present in the Odyssey, not only between men and women, but also between rich and poor women. Firstly, as we've discussed, Odysseus has relations with different women along his journey, most famously with Circe and Calypso. Yet, when he thinks back to the suitors in Ithaca, he himself acknowledges that if Penelope were to have succumbed to the attentions of one of the suitors during his 20-year absence, he would have no option but to punish her. Circe and Calypso are also women who live alone. So they are women who own property, they have servants, they essentially make all the decisions that traditionally would have fallen up upon a man. Because of this, they're portrayed and they're considered to be extremely dangerous. They are perceived to be a societal threat. While it's acknowledged that these women are highly competent, they can act in the role of a man, and it's actually explicitly acknowledged that all of these women are equally intelligent as Odysseus, but the fact that they're stepping into traditionally male role, this automatically makes their intelligence and their way of, of life dangerous. And this is a kind of a key difference between Circe and Calypso and Penelope. So Penelope, all these women are all very similar. They're very strong, they're very intelligent, they're very powerful, but Penelope remains within her role as a dedicated and faithful wife. Therefore, she is seen in a very benevolent light, whereas Circe and Calypso, who are much more independent and cover male type roles, they are deemed to be dangerous from a societal perspective. The other double standard is between rich and poor women. If you remember at the very beginning, I was talking about how Telemachus, he had gone to ask around to the other Greek heroes about where his father was. And at one point, he encounters Menelaus and Helen of Sparta, otherwise known as Helen of Troy. She is the very woman that, according to the literature, started the Trojan War because she essentially ran away with a Trojan prince. Now, by Greek standards, adultery by a woman is a punishable offense. So normally you would always punish women who step outside of their marriage within kind of ancient Greek tradition. However, Helen is able to return to her position as Queen of Sparta almost as if nothing had happened. By contrast, Odysseus, when he returns home to Ithaca, without giving it a second thought, slaughters all the women in his own court out of fear that they might have succumbed to the attentions of the suitors that were invading his space. Even though, let's be honest, I don't think that these women were necessarily engaging in relations with these men in a consensual manner for the most part. They are just simply not given the chance that Helen has because of their lower caste and therefore are deemed to be more expendable. Lastly, I want to touch on the concept of nostos, or return. The Odyssey is meant to show us what happens to heroes after their return home from a great war and how they adapt to their old life after having gone through harrowing experiences that fundamentally changes who they are. The Odyssey kind of leaves us with a question of whether Odysseus will be able to do that. So in a time of peace, he has returned home. Ithaca is not at war with anyone. Essentially, just by being home again, he has the power as the rightful king. And instead of using his famed skill, instead of using his metis, his intelligence to be able to rid himself of the suitors and get them out of his house, he chooses violence, and he chooses an action that essentially could have dragged Ithaca into a civil war had Athena not intervened. After all he's seen, after all his adventures, we're kind of left wondering whether he will be able to return to his normal life and be happy again on this island that he's so long to return to. And this is actually something that a lot of pieces of literature afterwards have explored. I'm excited to see this movie. I'm also a bit terrified. I have no doubt that it'll be visually stunning, but my main hope for it is that the characters won't be flattened. The Odyssey is not a flat story, and Odysseus is not a flat character, and I hope that he is not painted as a family man who's just trying to return home. I hope that the nuance and the motives behind his return home, or for wanting to return home, are explained in a little bit more detail. I also think it would be really interesting if Christopher Nolan tried to communicate to us or kind of send a message to us through this film and through this channel in the same way in which the bards and the storytellers would have tried to impart a lesson or a warning through their songwriting. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. Let me know if you have any comments or observations down below and what you're hoping to see from the Christopher Nolan film as well. If you have anything you'd like me to cover with regards to classical literature or really anything else, let me know in the comments down below. And see you next time.